All right, today we have Craig Gramlich from Lonewolf Consulting, Rich King from Schlouch, and Will Hipp from Tenna. Craig, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Will. I like to tell people that I build equipment leaders, and what equipment leaders are is companies that are committed to become their best, the absolute world class. They do so by reducing overspend, they do so by reducing waste, and by boosting their ROI on their equipment fleet. To do that takes something I call a use of the internal equipment triangle, which I understand Rich has got a slightly different terminology for it, but it's the intersection of equipment, accounting, and finance. And equipment, accounting, and operations, and all three of those are important to the business. So I dabble in all three, Wolfpack Consultants, and that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Craig. Rich, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Rich King. I'm the CFO at Schlouch Incorporated. We're a site work contractor in eastern Pennsylvania. Been with Schlouch for almost 28 years, and we own a lot of heavy equipment. We like moving earth, installing pipe, concrete curb, blasting, and paving. So heavy equipment after people, our number one asset. I like the fact that Craig put accounting and finance as 2/3 of the triangle.
Yeah.
So that was good, but
yeah.
You know, he jumped in quick with the operations correction. So, and we do call it the internal triangle as well. One of our vendors dubbed it something else. I won't repeat what he dubbed it, but accounting, finance as one corner of the triangle, operations and fleet, and has worked very effectively for us, just as it has with the work that Craig is doing with his clients.
And a little bit more about Tenna for those of y'all that may not be familiar. We are a mixed fleet management solution that helps support the equipment operations, that point of the triangle, but we actively engage and connect with the other 2 points via ERP integrations, as well as connected workflows that keep the site informed about the life cycle of the equipment. I guess starting off, Rich, tell us about how Schlouch has, brought to life the internal construction triangle from y'all's monthly, day-to-day perspectives.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, Will, initially we were exposed to the external triangle through AEMP, Association of Equipment Management Professionals. And there the triangle really is the OEM, the dealer, and then you as the client or the customer. So that triangle has to focus well and work really effectively as well for you to, really maintain your equipment, buy your equipment, and, have those external resources. After, we had a number of people start going to AEMP and get certified through their program, they brought that idea back and we kind of turned it inside, and we looked at if we can align accounting, fleet, and operations, we can really get some, great synergy. And if those three areas are working well together, where you have, operations is kind of our ultimate customer, and that's what we do. I mean, we're moving dirt, we're building work, we need to provide, reliability, uptime to operations, and they need to provide feedback on how well the machines are working for us. So that was a key part. See, that's an operational person over there. From the fleet side, it's about that, reliability, availability, what's the cost of the machine, which machine is, has better fuel burn, more reliability, lower maintenance costs, that we're getting more hours out of that machine. And then from the accounting finance perspective, looking at the rates, looking at how, the overall P&L looks for the equipment department and how it's impacting the overall organization. In action, what that means for us is every Thursday morning at 8:30, fleet, operations, and finance are meeting together to discuss all things equipment, from acquisition to operation to maintenance to that midpoint check-in to disposal. So that's how it's worked for us, and I think we've been meeting as a group for about, close to 15 years now.
So your equipment team knows about projects that business development is going after in advance of winning those projects. So there's open communication about whether or not the equipment needed for that bid package is going to be available if you do win that job.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Will. And the other part of that, if, we're not a multinational company, we have 275 employees. We're in eastern Pennsylvania. So, having that awareness of the projects that are coming up on that scale, we don't have an unlimited amount of equipment. So knowing what equipment's needed, what rental needs there are, that's really critical for, those inputs to come into the triangle.
Yeah. Switching over to Craig, I feel like we're all preaching to the choir here. How have you seen organizations be successful with developing the communication cycle and the culture that Rich just talked about?
Right. And great question, Will. I like to start a little bit further back, which is like the reality that a lot of organizations are kind of maybe in today. And there's a lot of warning signs that are kind of there that will be happening in the organization, whether you know it or not. And it looks like your equipment team is going to be hearing things like, your rates are too high. And your operations team is going to say things like, I want more equipment. And your accounting team is going to be kind of left almost like wearing a referee shirt, trying to figure out, I don't know who to believe, which one's right, but I just want a return on the investment. And you're going to hear things like that, and it goes deeper. And the equipment team will start saying things back and forth to operations like, well, stop breaking it and your rates wouldn't be so high. And, the operations team will just say, well, fix it right the first time. And so this is kind of the reality as to what takes place in an organization, which are signs that there's misalignment in your internal equipment triangle.
Right.
But to start pulling some of that together is you've got to get all three groups speaking the same language and wanting to improve. All three groups really want the organization to improve. They do, but they just do it in their own way. So with the equipment team, they believe they're guardians of the assets. They're the ones who are the protectors of the equipment because it can't speak for itself. So they have to speak up and protect it. And they sometimes have the flawed belief that we're an equipment company. But what's not really realized is the operations group is the ones who use the equipment to produce the revenue. And it's that work in the field that's done that is really the core impetus of the company. So the operations team looks at the equipment as a means to an end. Or Mike Vorster would say it's a destructive means to an end.
Yeah.
And your accounting team on the opposite end, again, is still kind of left in that referee-ish situation, trying to look at it as, what's a return on investment? How do I count this? It is an investment. I'm putting $1 million into it. How do I know I'm actually getting a return? And is that return a byproduct of the profit that the equipment produces on the job? Or should there be something else that is actually a return on that investment put into the asset because I've locked cash into it, like equity? So I like to start kind of further back about maybe what some of the warning signs and things people talk about or hear in their organization but not really know what's going on. But those are warning signs that your triangle's misaligned. And when you start to pull it together, you start to get to where, like Rich is with his group, and you start to see, we just do it. It's just business. We've been doing it for 15 years. We know everything about what equipment's coming up. We know what projects need what gear. We know what assets are going to be sold, what's coming in. And the benefits of that, Rich, like I imagine, like you guys are very conscious of profit and loss on each asset.
Right.
You're very conscious about your fleet mix and right sizing that, and you can probably pivot on a moment to go, we're going to rent that, or we're going to pull that in from another region, and be able to make those judgment calls, which other organizations, those are big things. Those are things that they kind of aren't really sure how to do today, and oftentimes freeze, and then their asset list just grows.
Yeah.
And it balloons.
Right, and especially with, the market and the changing work mix that you see, as Craig alluded to, like there's been a lot of warehouses built in eastern Pennsylvania and central Pennsylvania. That requires a lot of heavy earth moving equipment. So we were able to anticipate and buy additional assets by having that input from the estimating and the operations side. And then when we started to see maybe that volume of heavy earthwork backlog start to dry up, we were able to dispose of some of those assets that we purchased. And, at the same time, knowing that could change, you can negotiate like guaranteed buybacks, other things like that, to help support and minimize your risk. But it's really interesting. One of the things that Craig said was, this misalignment, and it may be we're not doing it wrong, but we're just not doing it together. Right?
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good way to phrase it.
That's not mine. That's our COO's, but I'll share that anyway.
Okay.
So I got that at the Triangle. So,
yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, share but steal shamelessly,
or borrow.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, for organizations that are just starting out and trying to figure things out, or for organizations that have already figured this out, what's the next level? Like, how can they hone their skills and their expertise, and rather than relying on gut emotion? How can they, rely on all the rich data that they're collecting throughout their monthly, weekly, daily cycles?
I think there are some basics that I think are really important to establish, just as far as tracking and segregating your rates into owning costs, fuel costs, and repair costs at a bare minimum, and then evaluating your actual rates that you've set compared to what your actual results are.
Yeah.
So I think if you don't have some of that basic information, utilization data, I mean, it's hard to kind of take the next step from there, but I think having some of those items and then building in a work order system, those are some of the basic building blocks I think that contractors need to have if they're just looking to get started. And then obviously from there, you can go to a whole nother level with KPIs, analytics, telematics, other things that you can do. I mean, Craig, what's your view and what do you see when you start working with contractors who are maybe, at that basic level or just trying to understand what are their equipment costs?
Right. So the two places I look, the first one is on the financials, is I want to see on the financial statements, what does the company believe they're really spending on equipment? Are they having a large takeout of their profit on the bottom line without even realizing it for some overspending? So when you start to, I would say, dissect the financials a little bit, you can see how clear and sophisticated they understand equipment and equipment accounting, because it's different than financial accounting. There's some differences you want to set up there. And once you do that, you can start to get a sense as to, now this is their current state. This is the level of sophistication the company has and how you can help them move from there.
Yeah.
And so I like to meet them where they are in that present state and go, okay, here's your next step.
Yeah.
And for a lot of them, that next step is, we need to create a baseline. What is your baseline that you understand it today for your costs, and what buckets of costs do you know today? And let's add in, maybe one or two more, and let's trend that over time and start to actually see, okay, let's make this improvement now, add this inspection in, change your PM, whatever that kind of looks like, and you can start to actually see the reductions or the impacts and the changes. Like one organization, like right now, we did that, and a year later, their shop costs are 39% lower, year over year, right? And you talk to operations as well, and the operations team is like, we're actually seeing an improvement in our support.
Yeah.
But it's by pulling the triangle in.
Yeah.
So there's huge costs to be able to be saved and waste that was there that may not have been seen otherwise.
Yeah.
But it takes financial sophistication and it takes baselining your data.
And that sounds like basic blocking and tackling. And from a financial perspective, that's great. But from a fleet management perspective, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about being able to categorize your fleet.
Oh, yeah.
You want to have units, whether that be make, model, or specific application, or size, capacity. Right. And what have you seen from your side of the house be the most impactful in that area of organizing your fleet?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I love this. The thing I see the most impactful is putting your house in order, right? And that really comes to organizing your fleet. And the term I put out there is a 3-level grouping, but really it comes down to 2 sizes. You do a function size and you do an actual size base. So you do, the function size is like, my articulated trucks all go together, my dozers go together, my excavators go together. That's the function, that's what I'm going to do. And then I need to break that down into what is the sizes of it. And cleanly, the easy one to look at is articulated trucks. I'm going to go, here's my 30 tons, here's my 35 tons, here's my 40s, and there it is. A lot of contractors themselves, they'll trip themselves up a little bit by seeing, here's a new model I just brought in, it's got a higher capital cost, I need to charge more for it, have a different rate for it. But what ends up happening downstream is you have cherry picking of rates on the project side, which is the project goes, hey, I want that other one because the rate's $2 lower, or I want this one because of this other reason. And it starts to create these games in the system if you're not careful. So when you create a structure that is like agnostic of your equipment and true to size and function base, it actually promotes just standardization. It's a step in the right direction of standardization in many areas, accounting, operations, equipment-wise. Because also coming from like an operations PM background, I didn't really care what iron showed up on my site. Like I had a preference, obviously, but I didn't really care what showed up on my site as long as I knew it was available and able to be worked and was the size I needed. It wasn't so much what color of yellow it was more about, do I have a 30-ton articulated truck when I really needed a 40? That matters more to me.
Yeah. Now, taking the step forward, We've defined how to segment our fleet. We've got good financial practice in place where we're able to identify what's ownership, what's operating or maintenance versus fuel. The importance of identifying that size class, I feel like we need to touch on, because if you have just a dozer class, you may have a 90 horsepower dozer and then a 250 horsepower dozer. Well, if you group those into the same class and set the rate, one of them is less competitive and the other one is being subsidized by that activity. So that's why you got to focus on breaking out the size classes.
Correct. Yep. Correct. And depending upon the size of your fleet, there's a natural law of averages that kind of kicks in, which is really nice. And it does so based on like fleet age. So where companies also get, stuck a little bit is, okay, I've got 2 dozers, to your point. I've got one that's, this age, but I've got one that's brand new. So why should I pay that same rate for the old asset when I've got this other brand new one? What ends up happening when you have a larger fleet, your age starts to space out as you start to do the acquisitions, and you start to get a nice blending and averaging, which is really what life cycle costing kind of starts to become, and that's really where internal rates start kicking in. So there's a lot of, I would say, science behind setting rates than just on the surface of looking, here's the purchase price and here's the the rate that comes out of it. Is you got to balance the needs with the business, and you also have to kind of look at what is the potential risk of creating a high rate and a low rate. How do I actually make sure my fleet is going to get chosen and used regardless? Because you're also comparing against rental houses too.
Yeah. Rich.
And we take a very similar approach as far as categorizing the rates and also as far as setting rates.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. We have about 15 triaxles in the fleet. We do a lot of sub-trucking, but we have 15 of our own. Just with timing, we're going to replace 9 of those triaxles in about a 3 or 4 year time span.
Yeah.
A typical life for us for a triaxle is going to be about 10 years. But we had some bunching up that took place. Normally, we try to use our churn chart to manage that and spread that out. But if you're going from an average price of maybe $240,000, $250,000 a triaxle, all of a sudden to now dropping 9 in at $315 or $325, it's going to have a big impact on the rate. So what do you do in that case?
Right.
Do you have like a big bump and have that rate increase come in at one time?
Right.
And then how does that play with estimating and what they're trying to do? Because they bid a number of jobs using that old rate.
Right.
And now you have this bump. So what we try to do is kind of feather that increase in over time. And we're doing that right now with triaxles, drills, and also trying to anticipate, in some cases, assets that we only have 1 or 2 of.
Yeah.
And I think that's really critical. And then sharing that, with the estimating team. Like we have a meeting with them every 2 weeks. And at our last meeting last week, I went to them and we were reviewing the updated equipment rates and explained to them the same process of what we're doing and why that rate is going up and, how we're approaching that and what the alternative was. And they seem pretty open to that. They're never happy when the rate is going up.
Yeah.
But I think having that transparency can definitely help close the loop.
Well, you're demystifying the rate.
Right.
And you're reducing the tension by doing that.
Yeah.
And that's critical.
Exactly.
If you develop it in a box and if you don't have sound assumptions, that generates tension and that generates conflict. And I think all encompassingly the 3 points, once you have that open and honest discussion and demystify the rate, it makes things a whole lot more fluid for the organization.
Yeah, and the transparency, I'd rather know. I mean, they're talking about it anyway.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have them tell me and tell our COO and tell our fleet coordinator than us not know, because if we don't know, there's nothing that we can do about it, but we can address their concerns and, provide some additional education, if there is an issue.
Right.
That's awesome.
So I got to ask then, Rich, when you're creating your internal rates, who do you have in the room? Do you bring that triangle in? Do you bring a representative from each group in?
We do.
And what does that process kind of look like for your group?
Yeah, generally for us, as far as setting the rates, we have one person that'll, pull all the data together. And then usually Kevin, who's our fleet coordinator, and I, we'll meet together first and go through all the details and talk about and come up with an initial rate that, the 2 of us agree on.
Yeah.
We'll then have our COO come in, and at one of our triangle meetings, we'll go through the rates with him.
Yeah.
get feedback from him, and then at that point, we actually send out a rate change sheet that goes out to all the estimators, all the department coordinators, and all of the field coordinators. So they have, before the rates go into effect, here's what the old rates were, here's what the new rates are, here's the difference, and for larger variances, here's an explanation as to why.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's really what our approach is.
Transparency, I love it.
Yeah. And we've certainly had feedback, from some of the teams saying, hey, I don't understand. Why is my rate going up by this amount?
Yeah.
And then oftentimes we're pointing to utilization. Utilization in a particular year or two that's not enough to cover the ownership cost and is not providing enough hours to recover your repairs.
Right. So utilization's a big one. So Will, I can see you're burning with the question. So jump in before I do.
Yeah, no, utilization, a lot of contractors struggle with that if they don't have defined processes. I think the beginning part of it is very manual and cumbersome for the user, probably a lot of spreadsheets, maybe some whiteboards involved. Then eventually you've adopted some automation, you have a system that you're entering in time units into that's extending your rate. You have change control over those rates. You can see what it was last year. You can see what it is this year. Then eventually being able to reduce the burden, because it's a very complex process. You're relying on something that was collected manually in the field is being input into a different medium, which might be an Excel spreadsheet or an email. And then again, it's going to somebody else who then has to get it into the ERP. And typically, organizations do reconciliations, and that again sends questions back into the field, back and forth, tying up more heads. I think the future of streamlining that process is going to involve leveraging on telematics, some AI, some great features that are coming down the pipe that our industry is desperately asking for. And so there's an evolutionary cycle, but before we can get there, we talked about the financial aspect, we talked about the organization aspect. How can companies leverage their data as a leading indicator before the rate does something that is disruptive to the business? Is there any industry guidance out there that people can rely on?
Yeah, there certainly is industry guidance on an overall fleet basis. And I think in part that's what AEMP and CFMA have tried to do with the heavy equipment comparator, is to come up with key metrics to recommend for the industry as far as what you can do. I think at an individual company level, you need to take that down and look at some of those key metrics within those equipment categories and types that Craig was talking about. But to me, I look at utilization, and to me, if I could just pick like one metric, it's probably utilization, because utilization really is an output metric that it's going to reflect the outputs of everything that you're doing, as far as what kind of capital you're putting into play and how well you're protecting and investing that capital, how you're investing in your labor, your parts, the processes that you put in place as far as your planning and scheduling, your PM process, your predictive maintenance processes, and all the other things that you do with scheduling, planning, etc. And that utilization is really going to show the end result of all that, in addition to how well the field is actually utilizing that equipment in the operation.
Yeah.
So if I could pick one, I'd pick that one. We can talk more about some of the other metrics that I think are critical, but I'd love to hear what Craig's view is on
I'd love to hear. Utilization's already been taken, Craig. You got to pick another one.
No, for sure. Yeah. So we'll come back to like what I think are the important KPIs. I do want to answer that question too. When I think about the utilization, though, I want to ask the question: what does the group think about utilization when you have, I would say, poor numbers from the past? You've maybe had a bad year or two or something like that. Utilization, because of the swing and the impact and the sensitivity you recognize, Rich, depending upon how your rates are built up, it can have a big impact on where that rate goes in the future. So, if you have a bad year, an off year, or you bring in more equipment and it drops that average utilization per unit, what does that look like to creating your rates the next year?
Yeah, from my perspective, you talked about the science that goes into rates.
Yeah.
There's also an art part of it that goes into rates as well.
Yeah.
And that's really where that comes into play. And I think, having access to information as far as what the work mix is going to be in the future, what we think the utilization is going to be in the CapEx for plans for the future, that's where I think some of that blending has to come into play, where you're looking at, all right, I know last year, if I look at the numbers in this particular category and asset class, we lost $10 an hour. And it was in this particular area. Probably if it was utilization, it's ownership.
Yeah.
What is that picture going to look like next year? And also from a life-to-date perspective, how are we looking within that asset class? If we see that year after year we're losing money, we have to increase the rate.
Right.
If on the flip side it's one bad year because of work mix, because of a dip in the workload, and maybe we didn't react quickly enough to that or anticipate that, then I think you need to take that into account and kind of blend or average that into your rate adjustment.
I want to add something to that. And this is an important thing for people listening. It's just because your utilization has gone down, that isn't a wholesale decision to reduce the denominator, which is going to have a negative impact on your rate.
Absolutely.
The correct answer is to sell equipment that you're not using and keep the rate as steady as possible. Would y'all, both of y'all agree with that?
I would agree with always looking at your fleet to right size it if you think it's sustainable, that number is low and going to stay low. Where I try to always guide an organization is to think about utilization in two perspectives. One is, if you look historically, that's like looking in the rearview mirror. You can look in the rearview mirror, but you cannot drive that car forward. You just can't. So when you're setting your utilization number for creating your internal rates, you want to look out the windshield. And what that is what's behind you. You've already driven there. You've already passed by it. But it's more about where am I going? And where am I going is going to be looking at who can decide that is my operations team. My operations team is the one I want to pull in and say, hey, where do you think utilization is going to land next year? And I can tell you what it was these previous years, and here's how that's kind of trended, but where do you see us going? And we use that as the denominator for setting in your internal rates. And if you see something that's really off there, then it goes, hey, let's ask a hard question and start picking some assets out to sell. Yeah, so in some ways, this starts to tie in where I see the KPIs, kind of the importance of the KPIs for each group is there's three. There's one for each of those key teams. Your operations team has to own utilization. Has to. That's all that matters for it. If there's one thing, that's the only thing that has to matter for that group. On the equipment side, their KPI has to be tied to some form of availability. That's it. Their sole reason for existence is making sure that that asset is available so operations can use it. And then on the accounting side, the real easy one I like to point to is like your over-under recovery or your overall profit and loss as an asset. And if you can track all three, the rest of the stuff in the organization starts to kind of fall into place. But if you recognize the sensitivities as how those KPIs affect each department, once you know to start tracking it, now it's who should track it, how we should track it. Because this is where, again, some games can kind of come into place, which is like on the equipment side, we're just going to track availability ourselves. It's out of our maintenance system. That's our source of truth. And operations will look at utilization and go, well, we're just going to track utilization ourselves. But the most impactful KPIs you're ever going to get are interdepartmental. And that would be your equipment team tracking utilization, your operations team tracking availability. It brings the skin in the game and brings the three groups, starts bringing the three groups together into that triangle meeting. Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. It's small, but it's huge.
Yeah, and on top of that, frequency of downtime events. How effective is the maintenance program? Because that touches both availability and utilization. For organizations that are just scratching the surface and wanting to leverage all those rich data points, and maybe they have a CMMS, maybe they don't, what's the best way to identify a down event in the CMMS and leverage that data for the future?
So what's the question?
The CMMS. So mainly identifying down work orders versus preventive maintenance work orders, identifying the demographics of the work types, I think is the key linchpin in leveraging that third KPI, which is reliability, mean time between failures, that has an impact on availability, that has an impact on utilization, that eventually does have an impact on the rate.
Right.
And so having a computerized machine maintenance solution that allows you to categorize the work that your mechanics are executing on, collecting those hours that they're putting into those types of work, can really help kind of bring everything together, because it may not just be one thing causing utilization to go down or causing availability to be poor. There's a lot of things that you have to consider. And I think that there's some industry guidance out there that may be overwhelming to some of those first generation people that are still on pencil, paper, whiteboard, or just now adopting some automated systems. But having a solution in place to keep your house in order. We talked about the cost. We talked about the fleet organization, but also what are my mechanics doing? And having that understanding is important for people to measure. Would you agree with that, Rich?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think as part of that, you need to set up your repair types in a way that makes sense for that tracking, as far as preventative maintenance, predictive maintenance, corrective maintenance, emergency work orders, which again, I think it's important to have a definition of what is an emergency work order or a red event. And having those repair types identified. Because I look at Craig's lists on the KPIs, and if you're going to pick a couple, I like what Craig has picked. And then from there, I think a lot of the other KPIs, they can be diagnostic. So if utilization is signaling, and that over-under on the recovery, or looking at kind of I like RONA as well, but I'll take that over-under on recovery overall and by asset class. We discuss that at almost every meeting, along with utilization. And then availability is key. The next question is, if you have that repair type data and some other metrics that you're looking at, why? So why was the utilization so low? We can go and we can look at other things that are then diagnostic. If I didn't have a very good preventative maintenance program, and as a percentage of overall work orders, those PMs are very low, or my planned maintenance is very low, or I had a very large downtime events per 1,000 hours, or small mean time between failure, keep asking why. If you've got those repair types and some of those other metrics, I think that's where that can become very diagnostic. And that's, I think, what we've tried to do with some of the things we've done with the heavy equipment comparator. But in practice, I say be curious and keep asking why until you find the answer.
I like that, be curious. What I tend to find, like with a lot of the questions of the why, they will always almost point back to your maintenance system. And not the system itself of the software, but I mean like the processes, the procedures, the plannings. What is there in terms of that for the contractor, and how sophisticated is it? Because if you don't have those plans in place that you're going to follow, you start to end up having unplanned repairs, breakdowns. You start to have all those items which then add cost, to your point, Will, which was the red events, which is your reported emergency down events. And those are the ones where you can tie that back into the heavy equipment comparator, because there is some of that information in there about the number of red events per 1,000 hours and things like that. But really, it'll come right back to your maintenance plan and program and what's in there. Is it something you created yourself and it is based on just some arbitrary, time-based or hour-based interval? Or is it tied true to the OEM data? And are you changing, each filter when it says to change it? Or are you kind of pushing some out a little further and bringing ones back? And did that contribute to the failure? So those whys that you ask are critically important, Rich, but they will always point back to something. As long as your maintenance team is doing something with it. And what I like to describe is, I'm a fan of keeping things simple, is what I like to describe is, for our mechanics, they troubleshoot the equipment. We want them to troubleshoot the equipment in order to get it back up and running. For our managers and our supervisors and our leaders, we want them to troubleshoot the system. The same way a mechanic troubleshoots a piece of equipment. So when there's a breakdown in the field, my mechanic goes out and they do the repair. If there's something that happens in the system that's like under, too many breakdown events, too much rework, what's wrong in the system now that we need to correct, and why did it happen? And that's when you start to make the continuous improvement, so you correct in the future.
Feedback loop that leads into the
100%.
flywheel of success.
Yes, exactly. That's That's in the one I've got and created it. That's the fourth quadrant, which is the one that's most often ignored, because once you've bought the equipment, once you've used the equipment, and once you've repaired it, you just go right back into the cycle of, buy, use, repair. But you forget about there's a portion there of continuous improvement or leveling up that is also, critical for the company getting better at what they do. And that's where I think, we were going to chat about, I think, the sophisticated of software and how that kind of can start to benefit a bit of that.
Yeah.
So
we touched on it a little bit earlier, but yeah, software, as long as you pick the right partner, you want to pick a partner. You don't want to just subscribe to a service that doesn't provide value. You want a relationship, you want a vested interest, you want a stake in the game with the person that is supporting you. And that is the most important thing. Picking the right hardware to put on your machines to leverage the technology coming off of that is very important. Also, buying a software package that is built by somebody that understands your business is extremely important. And if you can find the perfect solution, that's one quick way to identify efficiencies. Yes, there's going to be change management involved, but ideally, a year or two after implementation, that's when you start seeing the successes. And there's a lot of solutions out there, and there's also a lot of great consultants and a lot of good industry resources that you can go after. So the question was, how can people new to the game that want to drive success in their organization start out? I think the first step is measuring. You need to start measuring something. And then, after that, you can either expand and continue measuring other things, or you can, I don't know, Rich, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I think you need to get educated, and a great way to get educated, I think one way all three of us have been educated is through Mike Vorster and, construction equipment economics.
That's right.
So, many con expos ago, probably more than I'd want to care to say, I saw Dr. Mike speak here, and after his session, I went over and bought his book. And then I bought 2 more copies for the rest of the equipment triangle. So I'd say get educated, talk to each other, and work together. Again, if we're not doing it, if we're doing it right, we're not doing it wrong, but we're not doing it together, that's a problem. So having those conversations. And then I think one of the things that has been critical for us is the churn chart that, is in, that book, as far as looking at your assets, looking at, as our COO would say, what kind of seed corn do we have left? How many hours do we have remaining?
So you're measuring age and meter readings.
Yes. So that would be a couple critical things that I would say.
What about you, Craig?
I'll build on that a little bit. And so I'll tie it kind of back to the statement earlier, which is like, what are the things you need to track? So Will, you said you want to track some stuff. So it doesn't really matter what you pick to start with, pick something. Even pick your fleet count. If you don't really know what your fleet count is today, start there. And from there, you can then expand into by category. You can expand into my number of, mechanics. You can expand into your availability, your utilization, and things like that. But pick a metric, 2 or 3 to begin with, and start tracking. To go a level deeper for any of our equipment people or shop people that might be listening to this, I like to cover something called 3 rituals. And the 3 rituals kind of sound like this: these are the things that we do every week without fail, no matter what. If we do these things, we're going to be successful. The first one is a planning meeting, some form of a planning meeting. Pick a time. You may do it on a Monday. Mondays kind of make sense, but it's something where you plan your day, you plan your week for your shop and your people, and you look at, what are my PMs that are due? What maintenance do I have coming up? What equipment's coming in, going out? What job sites have breakdowns? Like you're creating a plan that your people are then going to follow throughout the week to execute. Then you move into what I call a connection meeting or a client meeting, and it's some form of interaction with your clientele. So if you're on the equipment side, your client is off. Go to the operations people, join their meeting, go to a job site, bring them coffee, bring them donuts. Doesn't matter what it is, go to them and bring something of value that can start a conversation and ask questions. Hey, how's it going? What it does is it starts to actually align that triangle, but a little deeper on the inside of it. And you start to build those relationships to hear the things that you wouldn't otherwise. Because if you're just in the shop, you're kind of in an echo chamber or in a silo on your own. and you won't necessarily hear or see the struggles that go on the job site that you can actually help with from your seat. And the last one is what I would call a money meeting. And to make that one's fun.
I like that.
Yeah,
that sounds
it's,
good.
it's a money meeting. So again, like, I like simple stuff. So I call it either Finance Friday or Money Mondays. Pick the day you like. And for a lot of people, they will struggle with this one because, like, I don't like to review money. I don't want to go through my bank transactions at home, so why am I going to do this at work? So you have to find a way to make it fun. And almost have to think of it like you're going to romance your money and date your money a little bit. Maybe you need to dim the lights and set a little bit of music and light a candle, whatever. Buy yourself a coffee, go to a coffee house, doesn't matter. But you're going to commit yourself a little bit of time every week, 30 minutes, an hour, in order to start looking at money. And the things there is, it doesn't really matter, because that'll be the next question. What do I look at? It doesn't really matter what you look at, provided you're looking at something that has money related to it. Maybe it's the cost report that the accounting team has sent you that you haven't looked at for the last week. Maybe it is a stack of invoices that, you know, didn't get reviewed and approved yet. Maybe it is your internal rate calcs. Maybe it doesn't really matter as long as it's got dollar value associated with it. You're actually going to be absorbing and improving the way you look at money for that side of the business. And if you do those are 3 rituals: a planning meeting at the start of your week, a customer or connection meeting in the middle of the week, and some sort of a finance or a money meeting towards the end of the week. If you do those 3 things, lather, rinse, repeat, every week, you will be successful as a fleet person.
I'm smiling at your date your money. If you don't date your money's going to date somebody else.
That's not wrong, yeah. It's going to go into somebody else's pocket.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time. It was a pleasure having a conversation with you.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Yeah.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. Always a pleasure.
Yep.
All right.